Hello guys, welcome to another Guts and Glory World War II episode of the podcast. Okay, so now, Chapter 10, Fighting with Tigers, the Battle of Kursk, July 5th through July 5th, August 23rd, 1943, Kursk, Russia. History shows that there are no invincible armies and that there never have been. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, churning up the barren Russian landscape at 34 miles per hour, Lieutenant Samusenko of the 1st Guards Tank Army glared through the T-34's gun sights at the rapidly approaching formation of hulking enemy panzers. Samusenko was unfazed as explosions mulched up the countryside, dive bombers screamed overhead, and armor-piercing shells whizzed past the turret. She was a lieutenant, was just one among an 840 vehicle-wide sea of Soviet T-34 medium tanks rolled into action against the best-equipped, most financial troops Adolf Hitler had to offer. With less than the survival of Mother Russia on the line, Lieutenant Samusenko calmly ordered the vehicle's driver to accelerate maximum speed and the loader to slam another 76.2mm anti-tank shell into the main cannon. Sometimes in war, and basically in a brutal, bloody, gruesome, no-holds-barred war between two countries that hate each other with an ungodly death rage, you need to throw tactics out of the window and just come out swinging. For Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, that happened in July 1943 outside the Russian city of Kursk. It was here, on a wide-open field, decorated only with the occasional anti-tank trench or artillery gun, that the two most powerful land armies on Earth fought the single largest tank battle in human history. It had been a long, hard, soul-suckingly terrible winter for the German Reich. After having their previously invincible armies stopped at the gates of Moscow and then decisively kicked in the panzers in the frozen rubble of Stalingrad, the Nazi armies were now in the unfamiliar position of having to locate reverse on their tanks' gear shifts. All across the Eastern Front, an almost endless wave of Soviet men and machines surged ahead, battering the Germans across the 500-mile front. But as the cold, mud-covered, frosty misery of the Russian winter slowly melted away, the hardened veterans of the German army knew it was time to drop another good old-fashioned blitzkrieg on the Ruskies and turn this thing around once and for all. And this time, they had a secret weapon, the brand new, spanking new Tiger I heavy tank. Of all the awesome tanks produced during World War II, none was more feared, more iconic, or deadlier than this one. The Tiger was a 50-ton behemoth of steel with a 4-inch thick armor plating and a super intense 88mm main gun. Steamrolling ahead at 23 miles per hour, this unstoppable, death-dealing Nazi monstrosity could blast apart Russian tanks from a mile away and then laugh while punny enemy anti-tank rounds pinged harmlessly off the hull with all the deadlines of a BB gun. Sure, they broke down a lot, and the engine had a nasty habit of bursting to flames every so often. When you can actually launch a high-explosive bullet roughly the size of a golden retriever more than a mile while driving over a stone wall at 20 miles per hour, you tend to forgive that sort of thing. So in July 1943, equipped with a brand new shipment of Tiger heavy tanks and especially dangerous Panther medium tanks, the Germans prepared to launch a massive counterattack that would sucker punch the Ruskies and flip the table like a cranky dude who's just realized he's about to lose another 10-hour game of Monopoly. The plan, known as Operation Citadel, was your straight-up old-school German blitzkrieg pincer attack. This time it was aimed at trapping hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in a pocket outside the city of Kursk. By this point in the war, the Russians had seen enough German pincer attacks to know what was up, and they did their best to build defenses accordingly. While the Germans waited for their trains to bring up enough Panther and Tiger tanks to mount an attack, the Russians put in minefields, built hundreds of hidden anti-tank guns, laid down miles of barbed wire, and dug trenches that were too wide and too deep for the German tanks to cross. They knew where the attack was coming from and where it was happening, but knowing the enemy plan and being able to stop it are two very different things. Just before midnight on July 5th, 1943, the Germans launched an all-out attack spearheaded in the south by the elite 2nd SS Panzer Corps and their ferocious Tiger and Panther tanks. A crushing wave of tanks, armored trucks, and other Holden war machines from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd SS Panzer Divisions tore through the front lines of the Russian armies. Bunkers exploded into towering fireballs all down the line as German tanks trampled their way across the plains, and anything left standing was a target for the fleet of Luftwaffe bombers that blackened the skies above. Also, there were the men and tanks of the Waffen-SS, handpicked for their stalwart devotion to Hitler and the Nazi Party and rocking the best training and weaponry in the Third Reich. Besides having impenetrable armor, better range, and a stronger gun than the Russian T-34s, these dudes were also veteran super soldiers who would routinely get off 2 or 3 accurate shots from their main cannon in the time it took the Russian crews to fire once. In just 17 hours, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had advanced to the front lines of the Soviet defenses and were threatening to complete the encirclement and the destruction of the Russian troops at Kursk. The Russian commander, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, responded by deploying the entire 1st Guards Tank Army to meet the SS head-on. 23-year-old Guard Lieutenant Alexandra Samusenko was already a 3-year veteran of the Red Army. Much of her background is clouded in mystery, but we do know that this dedicated woman had initially served as an infantry regiment during the Winter War with Finland in 1940. Though she had plenty of technical training as a mechanic, she was then sent to tank school in 1941 and trained on the T-34 medium battle tank. She'd fought Germans plenty of times and destroyed dozens of enemy anti-tank guns on the outskirts of Stalingrad. She was also wounded twice in battle, including one time when her tank was hit and caught fire and she barely escaped with her life. She'd earned the respect of her men so confidently that she was the only woman in the Red Army, and as of 2015, in any army in history, to command a tank on the battlefield, directing a crew of 3 other tankers, a driver, a radio man, and a loader. It was her job to position the tank, lead the troops, and, oh yeah, fire the main cannon, which is sweet. With no air conditioning, the crew of Samusenko's T-34 were baking in the July heat, but they just wiped the sweat from our foreheads and kept going, slamming the control sticks forward. Tanks use control sticks, one for each tread, instead of a steering wheel. The driver gunned the 38.8-liter V12 engine, rocking the 30-ton, 22-foot-long armored vehicle into action. An incredible 840 Soviet tanks hurled through the wheat fields and grasslands, bearing down on 294 German tanks, including almost 50 of the dreaded Tigers. The Russian guns weren't effective against these new U-boat tanks at that range. Their only hope was to get in as close as fast as possible. The Tigers took a fearsome toll, detonating T-34s and rolling backward to keep their distance. All along the miles-long battlefield, the scene turned into a swirling melee of individual tank battles and general chaos. Tigers took out multiple T-34s, only to be destroyed by a Russian soldier running up and throwing a bomb in the window. T-34 wolf packs attacked other Tigers, swarming them in the hope that one of their own tanks get a clear shot in the less well-armored back end of the Tiger. Panzer IV tanks and T-34s went shot for shot with each other, and anti-tank guns and dive bombers cratered the earth with humongous explosions. In the middle of the battle, Alexandra Samusenko suddenly found herself up against 3 Tigers from the 3rd SS Panzer Division, telling her men, "There is no turning back for us." She steeled her nerves and led her tank into battle, knowing that escape was not an option. Peering through the gun sights, she fired accurately and quickly, shooting on the move to give the Tigers a more difficult target to hit. Somehow, with shells whirling around it, this lone T-34 was able to knock 2 of the enemy out of action with a couple of deadly, accurate point-blank shots into the turrets of the enemy super tanks. Samusenko then damaged the 3rd Tiger with a shell that forced it to withdraw. Later in the battle, her commanding officer was killed in action, and Samusenko took charge of the battalion and led them out of a firefight at point-blank range with Nazi panzers. For her accomplishments, she received the Order of the Red Star, a Soviet medal offered for exceptional leadership in combat. She was also promoted to captain and given command of the unit, making her the only woman in history to command a tank battalion. Samusenko's intense bravery helped save her unit and took out a couple of enemy tanks in the process, but the 1st Guards Tank Army would be badly smashed up by the hardened SS Panzers and would ultimately be forced back in tatters. However, they had done their job. They'd bought enough time for the Russians to redeploy troops to prevent a breakthrough. As Soviet IL-2 Sturmovik attack planes soared overhead, dropping bombs on the Germans, and swarms of tanks and men came surging into the battlefront from every direction. The Nazis realized they'd lost their opportunity for a quick, decisive blitzkrieg victory. The Germans would lose 50,000 men and 700 tanks in the month-long battle at Kursk, and by the time the dust settled, they were back in full retreat all across the Eastern Front. It would be the last German attempt to counterattack the Russians in the war. Which Reich was that again? As I mentioned earlier, Nazi Germany is known as the Third Reich, with Reich being the German word for kingdom or empire. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, which began in the Viking days when Charlemagne and ran until Napoleon dissolved it in 1806. The Second Reich was the German Empire of the Kaiser, which ran from the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 until the German defeat in World War I. Death from above. A brutal killer stalked the skies across the battlefront at Kursk. Hans Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated serviceman in German military history, and the most kill-crazy human being ever to fly an aircraft in combat. Piloting a Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, Rudel flew an obscene 2,530 combat missions in World War II, a number that dwarfs that of any pilot from any country ever. Between 1939 and 1945, he blew up 519 Soviet tanks, 70 amphibious boats, 4 armored trains, a cruiser, a destroyer, hundreds of trucks and armored vehicles, and even the Russian battleship Murat. Rudel also shot down 11 enemy airplanes. The guy was so successful that Hitler had to invent new bravery awards to give him. Schutzstaffel, the infamous and feared Schutzstaffel, protective shield, better known as the SS, was the name of the military arm of the Nazi Party. It was like if the Democrats or Republicans had an armed forces branch that reported to their politicians rather than to the U.S. Army High Command. The SS was initially created in 1925 as a small group of 200 bodyguards, but once command was given to an evil-looking, monocle-wearing Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, the sadistic organization took on a life of its own. By the time Germany attacked Poland, the SS consisted of something like 250,000 men. It was broken up in two groups. The Allgemeine SS controlled the secret police, which is the Gestapo, and items related to racial matters, while the Waffen-SS was made up of elite frontline military shock troops. These crazy, scary guys were not considered part of the German army and were under the direct control of Hitler himself. So was the army, I guess, but that's beside the point. SS divisions were composed almost exclusively of soldiers who could trace their Aryan lineage back 3 generations. They were always given the best equipment, the best training, and the newest gear, making them by far the hardest hitting forces in the German military.